fellas, if I grab your attention, hope you're able to catch up a little bit there, share a few minutes together, talking about good things and challenging things, and hope there's some ways that God is showing up and using what we've been talking about, what you've been seeking to do, and using that in your life. So it's a great conversation. Glad to be a part of it tonight. So, all right. Hey, listen, we're going to start and we're going to dive into week 4 of our teaching time together tonight. And I want to invite you to take out the teaching notes. Those are in those table folders as well. And so if you want to pass those around the table, if you don't have those yet, and you can follow along in our next conversation in the series we've been making our way through called Love Thy Neighborhood. And at the very beginning of the series, I shared with you a few convictions of why we're talking about this. We believe that all of us have been created by God and called by God to be love to those people around us, the people in our lives that we interact with on a daily basis. And this series, one of the kind of tools of what we're talking about together, one of the ways that we believe we can actually do that with others. We also said that when we look at Jesus' life, we look at the manhood that he lived and reflected for all of us, the authentic manhood that he demonstrated in the life that he lived. One of the things that we saw that he did that we all should do as well is invest eternally in things that last beyond this life, that last beyond our last breath and into the life to come even. And so again, this series, one of the reasons why we're talking about this is we believe the things that we're talking about here can help us to do that. And then lastly, I pointed out to you that we believe that if you're a follower of Jesus and Jesus is up to something in the world, well then if you're a follower of him, you've actually been invited to not only receive of what Jesus is doing, but to actually partner with him, to play a part in the mission of Jesus in the world. And we talk about it in terms of Pathway like this. We talk about how Jesus came to lead us into a full life that can only be found in him. And we believe that part of our experience of a full life in Jesus has to involve actually getting to a place where we're leading others into a full life in Jesus as well. And so this is why we're talking about this over the course of the series. We've been kind of laying out for you a strategy that we've simply referred to as Bless. It's a strategy to help us love our neighborhoods, those that are closest to us, those that we live with and learn with and work with and play with. And the reason we've been talking about this strategy that we call Bless is that we believe God's strategy from the very beginning for what he was doing in the world, for rescuing and restoring this broken world that we actually made a mess of, but God never turned his back on or gave up on, has always been a blessing strategy. And we see this all the way back in the beginning with a guy named Abraham and how God engaged him. And we believe it's the same way he wants to engage us. We compared it to breathing, that just as we breathe in and we breathe out, there are things that God has given to us, that he's poured out into our lives, that he's passed along to us. We have to both breathe those things in from God, and then we also need to breathe those things out to others. And so when God gives us demonstrations of his love, or he blesses us in some way, or provides for us in some way, reveals his truth to us in some way, not only do we have a responsibility to breathe those things in, but then we also have the responsibility to breathe those things out. We are blessed by God to be a blessing to others around us. We've talked about over the course of the series. And one of the ways that we believe that we can do that is by engaging in these 5 kind of simple practices that we see in Jesus' life that we believe he's invited each of us to step into and to follow his example, to follow his lead with. So we've been talking about this strategy called Bless. We're using just the word bless itself as an acronym. And if you remember, as we walked our way through this, each of the letters of the word bless represent one of these 5 simple practices that we want to begin to activate in our lives and engage in on a regular basis. We want to make these regular rhythms in the places that we find ourselves on a daily basis. And we talked several weeks ago, first of all, about the letter B that reminds us that one of the things that we can do in any given situation with new people and new relationships and new places and even every new day is we can begin with prayer. And we talked about how Jesus did this. We talked about how this is how we discover the mission that God has for us. And it's also the way that we're empowered to do the mission that Jesus is inviting us into with him. And so we talked about that a few weeks ago. Last week off-site, we kind of combined the L and the E, and we talked about how L reminds us to listen. That one of the ways we can follow Jesus' example, one of the ways that we can play a part, that we can get in the game of what God's doing in the world is just to be good listeners, to be curious, to ask good questions. We talked about last week, one of the challenges was to talk less and to listen more, and the way that that communicates a sense of value and worth to people, and it begins to build relationships for deeper conversations. It communicates to people that we're actually interested in them, not just what we want to say to them, that we're looking for a relationship and not just an audience. And so we talked about how important that was and some of the things that we can do with that. We also talked about that one of the things we see in Jesus' life that we can do as well is just to eat with people, to eat together, to gather around tables in an unhurried way, to spend unrushed time with other people in the way that it communicates to them that we want to be with them, that we value them, that we want them to be a part of our lives. And as I told you last week, and reminded you again even at the beginning tonight, there's something about eating together with somebody that changes the relationship. And we see Jesus doing this over and over and over again. One of the easiest, I think one of the most enjoyable ways for us to play a part in God's mission in the world is just to do that, to eat together with people in an intentional way, in an open way, saying, God, where are you at work? How can I join you in this? How can I open up my life to other people in which we know that you're at work in their lives, and we just want to be available to join you in that. The first S in the word bless then is what we're going to talk about together tonight, the idea of serve. And then the next 2 weeks, we'll finish up talking about this, talking about story, the idea of God's story and what is God's story and how do we share that with other people, and then how do we share our story and what God's done in our lives and those kinds of things as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about serve. And to do as we've done every week with that, where I want to begin with you tonight is this. I want to talk first about the example of Jesus. And all of this, again, is rooted in what we see in his life, the things that he actually did that we believe he invites us to do as well. And as I think about Jesus' life, there are a lot of things that obviously if you read about him and you discover more about who he was and what he did, there are a lot of things that are just powerful and a lot of things that are just profound in the person that Jesus was and what he did. But one of the things I want to point out for you tonight, and where I want to begin with you with this, is this idea here, and you see it up on the screen, just the idea that the one who deserved to be served chose to serve. And I want you just to, again, you can write that down. I want you to kind of just think about that for a minute, because this is an easy idea for us to quickly overlook, or we get used to it. If you've been around the church for a while, you understand it. Yeah, Jesus came to serve. And yet I think we can really miss the significance of the idea here that the only one actually who truly deserved to be served chose to serve. And we see this all throughout the scriptures again, but it's such an incredible idea that God himself, the one who created everything, the one for whom all things belong to, the one who has all authority and all power, the one who apart from him, none of us even exist, that God, when he came into the world to rescue and restore the world, he didn't come with a bat trying to beat everybody into submission. He actually came, the one who deserved to be served, chose to serve. And we read about this again a lot of different ways, a lot of different descriptions, but one I want to read for you tonight that I think summarizes it so well is found in a book that was written by a guy by the name of John Mark. We just call his book Mark. It's found in the New Testament of the Bible. And John Mark was a companion of one of Jesus' earliest followers and friends, a guy by the name of Peter, and he recorded for us so much of what Jesus did. And one of the descriptions that John Mark gave to us is found in chapter 10 of his book that he wrote. In verse 45, and here's what he says. He says, for even the Son of Man, this was not just a general term. I mean, all of us as men, we're all sons of men, right? Our dads all played a part in bringing us into the world. We're all sons of men, but this was like a formal title. This was an official designation given to Jesus, referring to something that the Jewish people of his day were looking forward to. They were looking for a promised one, a Messiah, someone that God would send to heal and restore and to fix the world, and they would refer him in a lot of different ways, but one of the titles was the title Son of Man. And so Mark's talking about Jesus here. He's talking about the one, the chosen one, the promised one. And he says this, even that one, the Son of Man, didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, if you would read this verse in its context, you'd see that actually Mark's description here of Jesus that he gave for us was found in the context of a conversation one day that Jesus was kind of catching wind of amongst his earliest followers, a group of guys that we refer to as the disciples of Jesus. They were having an argument about really important things like who was going to be the best, who was going to be on top, who was going to be the number two to Jesus. And Jesus, again, as he always did, kind of knew what was happening and what they were arguing about, and that they were entirely missing the point altogether. And he says, guys, wait a minute. I know what you're talking about. I know what you're arguing about. You're trying to figure out who's going to be the best, who's number two, but you need to realize something. You need to understand that is the way that it works in the world, right? But Jesus goes on and he says to them, but that's not the way it's supposed to work. And he explains to them that, listen, in my kind of world, in my kingdom, when things are done the way that they were actually always supposed to be done, if things hadn't been messed up by sin in the world, if God's way of things has always been the way of things, Jesus says to them, it doesn't work like that at all. In fact, he tells them that in his way of things, whoever wants to be great among you should be your servant. This is actually one of the major themes of the book of Mark that he was writing for us. Again, I don't know your Bible understanding tonight. Some of you maybe have a lot of great Bible understanding, perhaps more than me. Others of you, it's a brand new thing. You don't understand any of it. I want to give you a little bit of orientation tonight about the book of Mark. We have actually in our Bibles, we have one book, the Bible, but it's made up of 66 different books, and 4 of those books we refer to as what we use the word gospel, which just means good news. They're 4 gospels. They're 4 different accounts of the good news of Jesus that tell us about Jesus' life, that tell us about his ministry, and all of them tell us about his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. And so there were 4 different accounts. We know them as Matthew, Mark, the one we're talking about here, Luke, and John. And in these 4 different accounts, you have 4 different authors that wrote them, and all the authors were writing for 4 different audiences. And Mark, John Mark, who wrote these words that I just read for you a moment ago, when he wrote his account of Jesus' life, the audience that he had in mind were the Roman people, the people of Rome, the Roman citizens, the Roman world that was so common that dominated the world of his day. And a couple unique things about the Romans is this: the Romans were not they weren't interested in theology. And they weren't primarily interested in philosophy and all kinds of head things. They were an action-oriented people. They were a kind of a power group. They wanted to know who is the biggest, who is the strongest, who is the baddest, who is the one that deserved to be in charge because nobody else could stop them. Who is the conquering king in the group that climbed to the top and made everybody else do what they wanted him to do. And Mark realized this, and he wrote his account of Jesus' life and ministry with the Romans in mind. And with that in mind, knowing what they were looking for who's the leader? Who's in charge here? Who should be in charge? Who's the strongest and biggest of them all? Mark offers them an option. He offers them Jesus. And he does it in a very unique and compelling way. You see, Mark's book, if you look at the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll discover that Mark was the shortest of them. He doesn't waste a lot of time with a lot of fluff. In fact, if you want to read an account of Jesus' life and ministry, and you're not much of a reader, and you're not sure you're ready for all the extra stuff yet, start with the book of Mark, because it's the shortest, it's the most action-packed, and it's focused on what Jesus actually did. And Mark knew this is what the Romans were looking for, and he presents him as this miracle worker, this guy with incredible authority and with incredible power. He presents Jesus as a conquering king, as another one to consider in this world of the Roman Empire where that's what they were interested in and that's what they cared about. And yet he presents Jesus as a unique kind of conquering king. He presents Jesus as a conquering servant king. Actually, one of the interesting things about Mark's account of Jesus' life and ministry, and specifically his description of Jesus' death on the cross, is this. Historians have looked back and they've looked at Mark's story of the sequence of things that happened for Jesus on the way to dying on the cross. And they've actually found some parallels between Mark's description of that and historians' descriptions of what they would refer to as like a coronation ceremony for new Roman emperors. When a new Roman emperor would take the crown and they would take the throne and they'd be the new guy in charge, there was a party, a celebration, kind of like an inauguration we would have in the United States for a new president. There was a sequence of things that went with that, and historians have connected some dots for us between Mark's description of Jesus' crucifixion and the descriptions of how a new Roman emperor was coronated and installed as king. And it's fascinating to connect those dots and to realize that in some ways Mark was saying, listen, Jesus, don't miss this. Jesus, you've seen this 100 times with Roman emperors in the past. You know how this works. Jesus is a king just like them. And yet in Mark pointing this to the cross and showing Jesus as a conquering king, but as a conquering servant king, he says Jesus is a king just like the rest of them, but he's also a king that is unlike any other king. Because this king doesn't come and flex his muscles and show who's in charge and make everybody do what he says them to do and uses all of his power and authority to gain more and more for himself. In fact, this king actually comes and flexes his muscles, so to speak. He leverages all of his authority and all of his power, not to gain more for himself, but to give himself away for the gain of others, for the world around him. You see, Mark went to great lengths. Many people actually describe this verse as the key verse that summarizes Mark's book for us, the reminder that even the Son of Man, the one who deserved to be served, didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is who Jesus was. This is how he did things. This is what he came to be, and in doing so, he showed us not only what God is truly and actually like, but the Bible describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God. He shows us what God is like, but also the Bible says that we all are made in God's image, and in that case, Jesus actually shows us what all of us were made to be like and to live like as well. The one who deserved to be served chose to serve. Something else that we see with Jesus that I want to point out for you, which is this, that in the example of Jesus, we see that throughout his life, the things that he did, the ways that he served, that for him, serving was both a way to sharing and also a way of sharing. I want to explain what I mean by that for you for a moment. Let me first of all address this idea of it being a way to sharing. It seems as we look at the life of Jesus, that there were things that he wanted to share. There was truth that he wanted to teach. There were ideas that he wanted people to understand and know and embrace in their life. And yet many times the thing that opened the door for Jesus to be able to actually do that with people is he would often begin by doing something for them. He would engage them. He would serve them in some way, and it would open the door for him to share with them something as well. It was a way to sharing for Jesus. Again, we're going to be talking about this more over the next couple of weeks, the idea of story and sharing God's story and our story. And one of the things that we find is that as we begin with prayer, as we listen to people, as we eat together with them, and as we engage in coming around needs that they have and serving them in practical ways, many times that opens the door for us to share and to relay God's story to people and to share our story with people as well. For Jesus, this was one of the ways that it worked. His serving others was a way to sharing. We actually get a great description and kind of a summary of this in another book of the Bible, a book that we know as the book of Acts. It was written by a guy named Luke, and Luke was a physician. He was a historian. He wrote 2 books that we have in our Bibles. One is called the Book of Luke, one of those Gospels I was telling you about a moment ago, and then a follow-up to that, a sequel to that, the book of Acts. And here's what he said at the beginning of Acts chapter 1 in verse 1. We're not exactly sure who Theophilus was, but he addresses Theophilus here. He says, in my former book, Theophilus, talking about the book of Luke, the book that described Jesus' ministry and his life and his teachings and his death on the cross and resurrection from the dead. He says, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. And again, it'd be easy to read over that, and perhaps this isn't exactly what Luke had in mind, but some commentators suggested that Luke was intentionally describing what Jesus did in this way, in this manner, in this kind of sequence, because this was often the pattern that Jesus followed. That many times he would do, and then often that led to opportunities to teach. As I put up here, he would do something for someone, and it often led to opportunities for Jesus to teach something to someone. And I think this is often not only what we see in Jesus' life, it's often how we see things work in our lives as well. For Jesus, serving was a way to sharing eventually, if the door would be open to that. I think it can be that way for us. But not only that, the other thing I wanted to point out for you is that, as we said, it's also a way of sharing. I want to point out what I mean by this. We see Jesus do a lot of things for people in his time here on earth. In his ministry, he did a lot of different things for people. There were some occasions where he was feeding hungry people, miraculously providing food that wasn't there, but then through God's provision, supernaturally showed up and was there. He was meeting a physical need for people in that way. There were other times where Jesus was healing people. They were sick in some way, and he was helping them to be made well. There were other times when people were lonely or ostracized, and everybody had written them off. They were experiencing relational needs in their life, and Jesus would come around and meet some of those. There were other times people were discouraged. They were buried in their guilt and their shame and the embarrassment of things that they had done, and Jesus came and offered them forgiveness and hope, of being set free from the guilt and shame that had buried them. There were so many different ways that Jesus came and met needs. And not only was that a way to sharing for Jesus many times, but it was also a way of sharing. And the reason what I mean by that is this, that for Jesus, all these different things that we see him do were not just kind of means to an end. They weren't just ways to sharing, as we talked about a moment ago. In many ways, the things that Jesus did in serving people were actually part of the end itself. It was actually part of what he had come to do. We see a lot of great examples of that, but one I want to read for you is found up here. Let me catch up on my slides. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 7-8. And in this story, Jesus sends his 12 disciples, again, this group of followers of his, out on a mini mission trip, so to speak. And as they're sent out, here's what he says to them. He says, guys, as you go, proclaim this message. He says, tell people that the kingdom of heaven has come near. And then he says, and here's how it works. Here's how it applies. This is what it means, that you announce that message to people. Then go and heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. And then it's almost this breathing in and breathing out idea that we've talked about, or being blessed in order to be a blessing. He says, guys, freely you've received. Make sure you to freely give. You see, I think what Jesus is reflecting here in these words is that when he came into the world 2,000 years ago, he didn't come just to take us to heaven someday. He actually came to bring heaven here on earth, to bring the reality of how things were in the beginning, how they were always supposed to be, but how our sin has caused us to miss and make a mess of here on earth. Jesus came to reestablish. When he says that the kingdom of heaven is near, what he was saying is, listen, I'm gonna show you what it looks like for me to be king of this world again. And he came to make right all the different things that our sin had made wrong, not just the spiritual issues that we face in life, but physical issues and relational issues and emotional issues. Jesus came to do something about all of that. And that being the case, anytime Jesus fed the hungry or encouraged the lonely or healed the blind or lame or released people from spiritual bondage, all of those practical acts of serving and coming alongside of people were not just ways to sharing or some kind of means to a much more important end. They were actually ways of sharing. Those things were actually the message. In and of themselves, they actually were the good news, not just means for hoping to eventually share the good news. They were a way to sharing, but they also were a way of sharing. And I share that with you guys tonight with this, and I think it's so important for us because we need to realize anytime we come alongside of and we meet the practical needs that people face because of the broken, sinful world that we find ourselves living in, anytime we find ourselves coming around something like that, just like we see with Jesus, we're actually a part of the mission. It's not just a means to the mission, it's actually an integral and central part of the mission. Not only do we see that with Jesus, the last thing I want to point out in his example is this then, that Jesus then invites his followers to do for others what he has done for us. And the greatest example that I can give you of that is found in one of the other gospels, the book of John, written by one of Jesus' close followers and disciples, one of his best friends, a guy by the name of John. And John records for us in John 13 this story. It's in the what's often referred to as the upper room, this last meal that Jesus had with his disciples before he was arrested and killed, crucified on the cross. He's eating this meal together with them. And in the context of that Passover meal that he was sharing with them that night, many of you know the story, Jesus did the unthinkable. You see, the culture in that day, when you would gather in a group like that, many times the house that you would gather in would have some kind of household servant, or if you were somewhat of an affluent group, you might have a servant that would travel with your group and take care of some of the menial tasks that nobody else wanted to do. And yet we find here in this story with Jesus that apparently they were too much of a ragtag group of guys. They didn't have a servant that followed around with them. If someone was going to do the duties of a servant, it was going to have to be one of them. And one of the essential duties of a servant in a setting like that in Jesus' day and age is that because they walked around in much less sophisticated sidewalks and roads and all kinds of stuff that we're used to today, their feet would get terribly dirty. And when you would gather around for a meal like that, you'd actually recline together around the table. One of the things is you didn't want to eat your food with stinky feet all over the place, covered in all sorts of disgusting and unimaginable things. And so one of the things a servant would do would go around and wash their feet. And as we read the story, nobody was itching to do that. Nobody stepped up to do that, except for the only one that didn't have to do that, that deserved better than that, who was Jesus. We read the story that Jesus actually stood up and he went around and he washed their feet. And they were appalled. They couldn't believe it. I mean, this was unthinkable. And then I want you to notice what Jesus said to them after this, after he'd washed their feet. He says to them in verses 12 to 17, he says, guys, do you understand what I've done for you? He says, you call me teacher, you call me Lord, master, and rightly so. That's what I am. You should call me that. He says, but now that I, your Lord, your teacher, now that I've washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set an example that you should do as I have done for you. One of the things I thought we could do to apply this tonight in our time together is actually to spend some time washing each other's feet as an application of that. And not really, we're not gonna do that. So some of you are sweating it thinking, I knew I should have changed my socks after mowing the grass tonight. We're not gonna do that tonight, but Jesus said to them, I did this for you. And if you're a follower of me, then I wanna challenge you to do for others what I have done for you. And I think that applies to us. Yes, Jesus hasn't literally washed our feet, but he certainly did in a much more profound way in the ways that he served and laid down his life for us. And he says to us, if you're a follower of mine, if you're here tonight and you consider yourself to be a follower of Jesus, this is what Jesus did. This is what he did for us and for the whole world. And then he says to us, now come, follow me, do for others what I've done for you. Again, this is all part of the way of Jesus, the way that he was a blessing in the world, the way that he invites us to do that. We breathe that in from him and breathe that out for others. The one who deserved to be served, chose to serve. He did it as a way to sharing and also as a way of sharing. And then he looks at us as his followers and he says, now come do for others what I have done for you. So how do we do that? A couple quick suggestions for you. I think one of the things that we need to do to help us with this just kind of tags into what we've been talking about so far in the series. I think if we want to do this well, if we want to follow Jesus' lead, one of the things that we have to do is we have to discover what people around us need by beginning with prayer, by listening to others, and by eating with others. This is why we talked about these other things. There's a rhythm to this where they all kind of work together. As we begin to pray, we ask God to open up our eyes and our hands and other people's hearts and to open up doors. We begin discovering things that are happening around us, ways that God is at work. We begin to listen to people. We ask questions, we discover their stories, we learn about them, and we discover things that are going on in their life. We discover where they're at and what they need as we spend time with people in actual life beyond just the small talk. And we get under the hood a little bit. We begin to understand who people are and what they're walking through. We discover the needs that they have, just as Jesus did so well and modeled for us. And then of course, once we do that, I think the second thing is we just need to seek to respond to those needs in practical and impactful ways. Again, Jesus was the expert with this. And I think his example is our example for all of us as well. When we talk about practical and impactful ways, we mean holistic ways, ways that as we discover where people are at, we do what Jesus did for us. We meet them where they're at. Sometimes it's physical needs. It might be something that they're faced with. It might be some physical need that they have, some kind of provision that they need. It might be something with their physical health that we can come alongside of, some kind of help. We talked about the home repair ministry earlier. I mean, it's a great example of what it can look like for us to come around physical needs that people have. Sometimes it's emotional needs, things that they're dealing with in their hearts. Maybe they're grieving the loss of a loved one. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they're overwhelmed with fear or worry or anxiety or something like that. It could be a relational need. Maybe as we listen to their stories, we discover they're having trouble in their marriage. Or maybe they have a kid that is unruly and doing all sorts of things and they don't know what to do and they just need someone to come alongside of them and to serve and to respond to that need and to help out in some way. It could even be spiritual needs as we talk about, with maybe questions they're asking or doubts that they have, or maybe they're totally oblivious to the reality that there's a God that could actually love them. We need to begin with prayer and listen and eat together and discover the needs that people have and then seek to respond to those needs in practical and impactful ways. I believe as we commit ourselves to that, God can use us. And whenever we do that, in whatever way we do that, we're in the game. We're part of the mission. We're investing eternally. We're being loved with those closest to us that we've been talking about in this series. Before we wrap up tonight, I'll just share with you one example of how I've seen God work in this in our own lives. It's actually the story of, or several stories of a family that we used to live down the street from and another house that we lived at several years ago. When we lived on this street for a while, we began to be convicted about some of the stuff that we're talking about. We're like, God, we know that you have us here and there's people around us. We just want to be available. We want to join with you in the work that you're already doing, God. And we would see this one family out and about. They'd be walking. They had an infant at the time who now is a much older child, but they would be walking, with the stroller down the street and all that kind of stuff. And so we would see them and we just began to pray for them. We said, God, we don't know them. We don't know what you're doing in their life. We don't know if you have a part for us to play in their life, but we're just praying if there's some way you want us to engage them. God, would you just open our eyes, open up our hearts and our hands and help us to see and to be a part of that. And over time, as we began to pray that, we began to kind of unexpectedly, you could say coincidentally, but we saw God's hand all over. We would be at our subdivision's playground, our little park area. We would show up at the same time. And our kids would play and we'd get to talk and hang out a little bit. And now not only were we praying for them, now we're listening, we're asking questions, we're curious, we're getting to know their names, we're getting to know how long they've been in the neighborhood and what's their background and where are they from and how long have they been married and just what's their story, where do they work, what are they going through? And after a while of developing some relationship with that, then we started doing this rhythm together. We said, well, you know what, we should get together. We should spend some time together as families. And so every major holiday, we've continued to do this even after we've moved now, but every major holiday, we make a meal at our house. They come over, they bring a craft for the kids to do that's related to whatever holiday it is that's coming up, and we spend time together. And as we've done that, as we've prayed for them and listened and we spent time eating together with them, God has revealed so many different things in their life. There were needs that they had that we had the opportunity to come alongside of. Sometimes they've been physical needs. We've been able to help with projects at their house. We've been able to provide meals for them when they had lost a loved one and they were going through a tough stretch. Sometimes they were emotional, relational needs, things that they were dealing with, family dynamics, some of the challenges they were faced with. We've been able to come alongside spiritual needs. When one of them was dealing with tremendous anxiety and worry, we were able to encourage her with truth and pray for her and be able to come alongside of her in that way. And over again, I think this is just one example. This is how God wants to use every single one of us. And we're not perfect at it. And we're not always as available as I think God would have us be. But I think as each of us opens up our lives and begins to engage in these and seek to be a blessing with what God has blessed each of us with, well, then we can see God work and move and use us to love our neighborhoods, those who are closest to us, in exactly the same way. And so that's my challenge for you this week. Again, we've been walking through this series. If you have that bookmark that we gave out in week 1 in your book, we talked about when it comes to prayer, our commitment for that is I will pray for the people in my life and the places that I'm in. When we talk about listening, as we talked last week, I will listen to and discover the needs of others and the places where God is at work. With eating, I will share meals and spend time with people in my life. And then we're adding to that this week that I will respond to the needs of others and help them in practical and impactful ways. My challenge for you this week, and what I'm gonna have you talk about at your table time together when we begin next week, is I want you to pray about, and I want you to try to step into at least one opportunity with someone that maybe you wrote down on that My Neighborhood card in week 1 or 2, someone in your life that you can serve in a practical and impactful way this week. And then next week, you'd have some stories to tell around the table of how God was in the midst of that and used that in some exciting and perhaps significant way. So I want to challenge you to do that, challenge you to read chapter 5. And then next week, we'll talk about story and begin talking about God's story. You want to bring that little booklet called The Story that was in your book when you pick that up in week 1. And it's going to be a great week next week. You won't want to miss that. So I want to give you the rest of our time to unpack some of this, talk about this at your tables. And so I'm going to turn things over to your table leaders and give you about 30 minutes on your mark. Get set. Go.